offering an aphrodisiac. The girls immediately appear behind him, and the protagonist gets very serious and tells him that he was just jotting down the prices. He also gives them an example so they can do the math, and the only one who answers correctly is Ghislaine. But because of Iris's pride, the protagonist prefers to congratulate her even though she's wrong. A little while later, the protagonist finds the girls looking at the prices of the books. He immediately realizes that they're quite expensive, since they cost about 7 gold coins. Iris tells the protagonist that he can take it, since she'll pay for it with her grandfather's money. But the protagonist gives her a lesson and tells her that she shouldn't spend money that isn't hers. He also explains to her that he and Ghislaine earn only 2 gold coins a month, so she should consider having her own money to be able to give these gifts. Finally, Redux tells her that he'll definitely speak with her grandfather so she can have her own allowance. A few hours later, we see the kids returning when suddenly the protagonist notices a large structure in the sky. Ghislaine explains to him that it's the famous floating fortress of Pelagius, the Armored Dragon King. Iris adds that he is one of the 3 heroes who defeated the demon god Laplace. The protagonist, still not knowing who Laplace is, mentions that it was a demon who tried to exterminate all humans. The protagonist has a feeling that he had already heard this story, and he remembers that his parents used to read him this story when he was a little boy. So he thought they were simply stories and tales like the ones people in the other world had. Finally, Ghislaine tells him that the structure has been floating in the air for 400 years. The protagonist thinks it would be great to visit it someday. A few days later, we see the girls studying, while the protagonist thinks that, since Iris got a day off, she's been calmer. Suddenly, we see Iris hand the aphrodisiac, which Rudius had been interested in, to the protagonist. This was a gift from the girl, and she asks him what it's actually for. Clearly, the protagonist gets very nervous and tells her that, thanks to him, his parents give him an allowance, so he bought this with that money. The protagonist tries to change the subject, but Iris keeps asking him what exactly it's for. Rudius tried to escape, but Guile managed to catch him. However, Rudius gets very sad because he ended up dropping it. So he finally tries to escape and the girls torture him, tickling him so that he clearly tells the truth. A few weeks later, we see that the girls' training continued, as did their learning to use magic spells. Shortly after, we see that the protagonist finally manages to finish a figure he was making in the shape of Roxy. He was even so meticulous with the figure that he ended up making her panties. He is immediately interrupted by a woman who introduces herself as Edna. She sits down to talk with the protagonist and asks him for a bit of help, since in a few months it's Iris's birthday and they'll celebrate with a party for nobles. So the main event is Iris's ball, and because she's just learning, she needs him to help her with her lessons. The protagonist agrees without any problem since he would be helping the girl. The next day, we see the protagonist and Philip in the mansion's library. He shows the protagonist a book that was created by the goddess of beasts. Hero's confused. Philip says that book let him hire the beast girl, so he explains it right then calmly. Right away, Rudius tells him that he has a thing for the girl's ears, and it seems they both share the same tastes and everything, since Philip says he finds them very cute, as well as the girl's little tails. Finally, Philip gives special permission for the protagonist to use all of this in the books. So the protagonist mentions that he'll take the Book of Beasts since he's interested in learning other languages. A few hours later, we see the protagonist writing Roxy a letter about exactly what he plans to do with his life. A few days later, the protagonist becomes very desperate about how difficult it is to learn to speak the language of demons and beasts. At that moment, he hears a noise outside his room and realizes it's Iris, who ran out of the rehearsal she was having with Edna. The girl begs the protagonist to convince Iris to continue practicing, because otherwise she will be the laughingstock of the whole family on her 10th birthday. So Rudius agrees to help her. Immediately, the protagonist goes to Iris and asks her to continue her dance lesson, but she refuses, saying she won't go to the party because she doesn't want to do something she can't do yet. The protagonist remembers that in his past life he let many opportunities slip away, and by not putting in more effort, he clearly didn't take them. She tells him she wants to be like him. He's good at everything. But Rudius refuses this and replies that he finds it very difficult to learn new languages. Stop! He loves obstacles. The harder it is, the more he enjoys finally fully mastering it. These words make the girl think, and she immediately tells him not to waste any time and to go practice. In a scene change, we see both of them start dancing together, but the girl is a complete mess, so she ends up throwing the protagonist against the wall, and the protagonist thinks that it will take a miracle for this to happen. During the following days, we see that the protagonist continues learning languages with the help of Ghislaine, as well as selling the figurine to a merchant who had made one of Roxy. After several days, we see that Iris is getting more and more used to the dance, so she doesn't get as angry. That night, we see the protagonist very frustrated, since he still finds it very difficult to learn to speak other languages. He is immediately interrupted when he goes out and receives a package. Inside it is a scroll with a reply from his teacher Roxy. Roxy tells him that, because the protagonist has been having difficulties with the demon language, the girl made him a handmade book so he can understand it better. She also tells him that the perverted prince who is teaching him bought a figure that looks exactly like her. Rudius becomes very happy, since he hadn't expected the figure of the girl the merchant sold to reach the kingdom of Chiron. Finally, Rudius takes the book the girl sent him and is very grateful to her. The next day, we see Iris rehearsing with the protagonist, and she seems more knowledgeable about the dance. Edna praises her, saying if they keep it up all day, she'll be ready for tomorrow's big dance without any last-minute panic. The next day, we see the protagonist at the girls' party when suddenly Iris appears with Philip and Soros. Edna and the protagonist talk and both hope that there won't be any incident with the girl. Then Soros mentions that it's time for the main event. Shortly after, one of the boys approaches Iris and asks for her hand so they can dance. The dance begins, and we see Iris getting a little nervous, since she's dancing too fast and ends up falling in front of everyone. Everyone there starts whispering, saying that she's a disaster as always. Rudius becomes very sentimental with the girl, so he musters up the courage and approaches her to ask for her hand. Once the dance begins, she's still nervous, so the lead guides her using a small tricky nose. So after following the instructions, we can see that the girl performed the dance perfectly, leaving everyone there completely fascinated. A little while later, Edna talks with the protagonist, and he tells her that simply by using a sword training technique, since the girl's only problem was that her movements were very, very fast. We can also see that the protagonist now has many female followers who want to be with him. Later that night, we see the protagonist give Ghislaine and Iris wands with magical gems, because Roxy taught him. Each teacher must do it with students too. We also see Ghislaine take one of the rings that comes from the legacy of the Beast people and clearly hand it to Iris. Iris thanks him profusely and tells him she'll take very good care of him. The next day, we see the protagonist wake up and discover he slept next to Iris. He gets a little horny, but immediately thinks better of it and lets her sleep. Shortly after, he goes out, and we see him climbing the stairs of a tower. As he climbs, Rudius hears someone having sex. So when he reaches the top, he realizes that Soros was with a beast girl. She runs off, and then Soros and the protagonist start talking. Soros shows him a sort of object in the sky, and neither of them realizes how strange it is. However, Soros says that it apparently isn't dangerous. A few months later, we see the protagonist approaching his 10th birthday, and he thinks Iris has come too far in her sword training. In a scene change, we see Iris and Ghislaine planning a surprise for the protagonist. However, the protagonist spies on them and realizes they're preparing a surprise party for him. However, the protagonist leaves the area while explaining to us that the Boreas family cannot disclose much about him. He also mentions that he recently discovered that his father's full name was Paul Nodos Greyrad, and he adds that the Nodos are one of the 4 families of the Greyrad lineage. He also adds that the leader is Paul's brother, and there is a secret mission to remove him from power. Also, the fact that someone like the protagonist, who comes from the Nodos family, is protected by the Boreas could lead to misunderstandings, and that's why his party should be much smaller than the one they threw for Iris. A few hours later, we see the protagonist in front of Ghislaine, and he realizes that the maids are a bit restless. Ghislaine tries to distract him by asking whether he had learned the 3 languages he was studying. The protagonist confirms it, and the girl is very amazed by Rudius's talent. He also tells her that he's hungry, so they should go get a snack. This makes Ghislaine nervous and immediately blocks his path. Rudius immediately realizes it's her birthday, so he takes the girl and clearly shows her his figures. Ghislaine's fascinated with the figurine, but says it still needs a tail. The protagonist takes advantage of the opportunity and tells her that he couldn't make it because he doesn't know what the base of her tail looks like. Ghislaine, without thinking twice, pulls down her pants, and the protagonist is astonished by the musculature of her buttocks, since they're literally like two rocks. One of the maids immediately comes in to tell Ghislaine that everything is ready, only to find herself in a very, very compromising situation. We then see the protagonist enter a hall, and everyone there congratulates him on his birthday. While pretending he didn't know about the surprise, the protagonist begins to cry and says he thought he hadn't been welcomed, that they hated him, and he never imagined they'd throw him a party. This clearly touches Soros. With tears in his eyes, becomes angry and says that he will kill a man named Pillamon, and will put Redux at the head of the Nodos. Clearly, this causes his family to remove Soros immediately, and Iris tells him she has a surprise for him, and he asks if his family has come. However, Iris refuses and tells him that they couldn't come because of the number of monsters on the road. Suddenly, Hilda hugs the protagonist, placing his head between her breasts, and tells him that they now consider him a son. She wants to adopt him and tells her daughter Iris should marry him. Iris gets very nervous and tells him that they're too young, so they end up bringing out her mom like they did with Soros. Iris asks Alfonso to bring her surprise, and while he opens it, she explains to him that they obtained the strangest materials in the entire kingdom, as well as giving them to the best staff maker they have. So immediately Rudius realizes that it is a powerful staff, which they call the arrogance of the Water Dragon King, or they also call it Akisha. Rudius at that moment realizes that it's worth a fortune, but Iris says a few words and tells him he should just enjoy it. That's all. Afterward, everyone there celebrated for the rest of the night. A few hours later, we see Ghislaine take Iris to bed. Likewise, the protagonist stays to chat with Philip, and he tells him that Iris had two brothers, but they went to the capital because all men in the Boreas bloodline are raised to be heads of the family. Judging by what he says, at first Hilda really hated the protagonist, since if her children had left, there was no reason to accept a child wandering around the house as if he were hers. Suddenly Philip becomes very serious and asks the protagonist if he plans to marry Iris and take command of the Boreas family. He even offers his daughter, tied up, if he wants some fun. Rudius turns grim, thinking he can't possibly mean it at all, right then. Besides, he thinks he doesn't want to be in the middle of this family political dispute. So before going to bed, he tells Philip to pretend they never had this conversation. Later we see the protagonist arrive at his room and, to his surprise, find Iris there. She tells him that he'll sleep with her tonight, and Rudius wonders if her father has convinced her. Rudius, a total perv, tries to take advantage. After groping the girl, she beats him badly in return. She thinks she overdid it, so she leaves now. Rudius stays on the floor thinking that she really went out of her way so he wouldn't be alone on his birthday. So he thinks about apologizing to the girl. Next, Iris returns and says it's a special day, so she'll forgive him. Finally, she leaves him with a small hope by telling him that in 5 years he could do whatever he wants to her. So she asks him to control himself until then, and the protagonist accepts without thinking. The girl says goodbye to him, and Rudius is very happy since he'll only have to wait 5 years. But at that very moment, he remembers his friend Sylphie. In a scene change, we see Paul alongside several men fighting some creatures. He laments not having been able to go to his son's birthday. We also see Sylphie arrive at the protagonist's parents' house, and we can tell that his sisters are now much older. Also, Sylphie gives Lilia a necklace and asks her to please deliver it to the protagonist. Additionally, Lilia mentions that she clearly has something very valuable that she will also send to the protagonist. Zenith tells us about when the protagonist left, and Sylphie took his departure well. So learning to defend herself alone against the bullies who bothered her was a lesson. Paul then appears, and everyone manages to spot some very strange clouds in the distance. We also see that Roxy, from the kingdom of Chiron, observes and senses a very strange presence in the kingdom of Asura. In a scene change, we see a man in the mountains who is attacked by a dragon. However, When it approaches him and sees the mark on his face, the creature decides to leave. We also meet the man named Orsted, the dragon god, who has been cursed for being hated by everyone. He mentions that apparently something has gone wrong, since he senses a large accumulation of mana in a single location. In a parallel scene, we see a girl who introduces herself as the Demon Empress Kishirika Kishirisu. She notices the presence of the mana buildup and says that she will have to go meet the person who cast that spell. Meanwhile, in the floating fortress, the mysterious figure orders that the person casting the mana spell be found out and eliminated, since apparently someone wants to break the seal they placed on the Demon King Law Place. Back with the protagonist. He's in a field testing his new staff. After testing it with a water attack, he realizes he can attack using very little mana. So he tells him that he will teach him his most powerful attack called Cumulonimbus. So he will begin to accumulate his mana, and we'll immediately see that the strange sphere in the sky clearly opens several mana portals and everything. Rudius says that it wasn't him, so Ghislaine tells him that it would clearly be better to return to Roa. Immediately afterwards, they are struck by an impact coming from the strange place. We see Ghislaine jump into battle at once. After exchanging and blocking several blows, a masked man introduces himself to them as Amalfi and calls himself Amalfi the Radiant. And by orders of Pelagius himself, he has come to eliminate the one responsible for that summoning. Ghislaine tells him she belongs to the royal warriors and explains to him that they were not responsible for this. So Amalfi tells him that if it's a lie, he'll pay for it very dearly. And the protagonist begins to wonder what might be happening. But Amalfi immediately leaves, and we see the sphere in the sky disappear, absorbing all the mana in the area and creating a massive explosion there. The boys try to run, but we see that they are hit by the explosion. In a scene change, we see that the protagonist wakes up in the body of his former life. He thinks he has died a second time, and immediately a man appears who introduces himself as Hitogami, a human god. Hitogami tells him that he has been watching the protagonist's entire life and has found it very, very interesting. He also adds that he is there to help him, but immediately the protagonist becomes very aggressive, since he thought that all this time his new life had been a dream, and that he was actually dead. But the god tells him that it's not a dream, and that he really reincarnated in this other world. The protagonist calms down, and then asks him why he has the body of his former life at that moment. He replies that that's how his mental form appears, so when he wakes up he'll return to the body he currently has. After a brief chat, we see that Hitogami is quite friendly toward the protagonist, but he tells him that the protagonist's attitude doesn't matter, since he might die, because he keeps the demon in a very hostile place with many dangerous creatures, not to mention that there is little food and water. Rudius, not knowing what the god was saying, tells him that the mana light that was created teleported him to another place. The protagonist finally decides to listen to the god, and with these last words he tells him that when he wakes up he will find someone nearby. He also tells him to trust him and help him. Shortly afterward, the protagonist wakes up and we see that Iris is beside him, resting. We also see that there is a lit campfire, and he wonders where Ghislaine might be. However, he's surprised to find none other than a super standing in front of him. He gets scared and takes his staff, since he had heard many bad stories about these creatures. Right away, the protagonist greets him in his demonic language, and this greatly surprises the super. So the super tells him that they fell from the sky and lit a campfire to keep them warm. The super also asks him if he isn't afraid. However, the protagonist thanks him for helping him and adds that he couldn't be afraid of the person who saved his life. Right away, the super introduces himself as Ruard Superdia. The protagonist asks him where he is, and Ru says he is in the northeast of the Demon Continent, so he wonders how long it will take them to get back to his home. The protagonist says that they apparently got trapped in a mana catastrophe, so Ru kindly says he will accompany him to his lands. Pork abandoning him here would further ruin the super's reputation. Immediately afterwards, we see Iris wake up and start screaming in fear. She also starts crying a lot, and Ruhr tells Rudius that this is a completely normal reaction. So, in short, Ruhr considers the protagonist somewhat normal. He didn't have the same impression as most people. Right away, Iris tries to introduce herself to him, but she can't stop trembling with fear. So after a long talk, Iris mentions that her mother had lied to her all this time. Since, if you remember, everyone in the kingdom used to tell children the story about the super devouring them if they didn't go to bed early. So all of a sudden everyone became friends. Finally, Rudius thinks that somehow he must return with Iris safely. After days surviving, they finally reach a village. However, at the entrance a guard meets them and says he won't let them pass because they clearly look suspicious. Rugier tries to reason with him, so the man says he'll bring his leader. The protagonist is left confused because the guard doesn't move from where he is, but Rugier tells him that the Migger tribe can communicate telepathically. The village chief arrives, introducing himself as Rokus. The hero's neck amulet immediately catches Rokus's eye as he steps closer. The protagonist tells him that his teacher Roxy gave it to him. This causes a man who was accompanying them to mention that Roxy is his daughter. We also meet the boy named Rowan. The protagonist in this